Hi, welcome to this video where I'll be going over some general points on group writing that are applicable to a wide range of professional communicative deliverables that may, for whatever reason, need to be written jointly. So this visual shows a spectrum of different approaches to collaborative writing. First of all, I just want to note that although this visual on the axis uses the term in-person collaboration, for our purposes, we can really interpret this as any synchronous collaboration. So it's really about contrasting what's being done synchronously versus asynchronously, as opposed to necessarily in person. It's a separate issue to what extent being in person is preferable to meeting virtually, but that's not something we're getting into here. So all of these various approaches could have their place. And in the real world, they all happen and they can all be valid. For class purposes, I'm going to ask that you avoid the end of the spectrum where one person is basically the writer. I think it's important to not go that far. But as a practical matter, that still leaves you with a range of options. Um, and that's not to say there aren't times in industry or other contexts where that is the norm, but it depends on the expectations of the audience and the needs of the situation. So for our purposes, you could go in the middle where you meet periodically to do the planning and the editing and the merging, and then you go your separate ways for a while for revision and or addition as needed. Wherever you fall on this spectrum, it should be iterative. So you should always have the approach that writing is going to take multiple iterations to where you're incrementally improving what you've done, sometimes scrapping what you did and starting over, hopefully not too often, but in any event, it should be iterative. But on the other end of the spectrum, we have basically everybody doing most or all of the writing together, synchronously. Now, the more people you have on your team and the longer the document is, the more impractical this might become. But for relatively small teams and or short documents, this can have benefits. For example, when you're all there agreeing on everything as you go, seeing what in real time what everyone else is seeing, you may need somewhat less rework. So even though it should be iterative, you may not have as many instances of that middle category where you come together and realize, uh, something one person wrote in one section uh, isn't really compatible either logically or even stylistically, and so it takes some time to work that out. Whether that working out is done by one person or together is that's really up to you. But the when you're all together, you may have things like that happen less often. So there's pros and cons to various approaches, and each team has to try to come to a consensus on what approach works best for you and your circumstances. So I also just want to note that these are just examples. These are for example, here where it says writing done in pairs. Well, if it's a very large team, it could be, you might split the team up into halves or thirds or what have you. Or when it says all, you might make it most. So, interpret this with a little bit of looseness, but, you get the idea. All right. So finally, I just want to talk about some general points about a lot of these may kind of seem like common sense once you hear them, but sometimes you wouldn't necessarily think to consciously or explicitly address them. So I just kind of want to highlight these here. So One thing that's really valuable is upfront, early on as a team, explicitly acknowledge and discuss the various steps and just kind of talk about everybody's thoughts on how to approach them. So you have pre-writing where you're kind of agreeing on the most fundamental level of what you're even doing. Now, sometimes that may be largely stipulated for you based on the nature of what you're writing, but to whatever extent you have discretion on that, you want to discuss it. Planning and logistics, where you actually take stock of everybody's availability and think through everybody's preferences uh, and decide on your division of labor for these subsequent items here, which include research and data collection, which of course can take various forms. Is somebody doing work in the lab? Is somebody doing, library research? Uh, does the data need to be curated and analyzed? So what's going on there? What's needed for depending on the project, depending on the communicative deliverable? The actual drafting, the actual composing of prose and visuals. And then revising and editing. Also, revising and editing, keep in mind, are best separated. Not that doesn't necessarily mean there can't be any overlap, but try to appreciate that they are distinct. Revising is higher level. It refers to that iteration I talked about before, where you're really rethinking the structure or the content or the substance of what you're writing, whereas editing is more granular. That refers to more the at the sentence level, maybe organization of paragraphs, but you're really maybe the exact wording of headings or subheadings, but you're not really thinking through the overall logic and structure and content. And I'm not going to pretend there's no gray area between those two, but it's worth thinking of them somewhat separately, because for one thing, you don't want to waste a lot of time getting a sentence perfect if that sentence may be relocated or eliminated, and that could change whether that work was even worthwhile. So when you're getting into the particular transitions that you use within a paragraph and things like that, make sure that the overall document is pretty much the way you want it before you spend a lot of time on that. Also, from a standpoint of giving credit or acknowledgement, revising is more likely to fall on the line of authorship. Or co-authorship, whereas editing is more likely to be something you may acknowledge as a contribution short of authorship. Um, and the definition of authorship, by the way, has some variations and different conventions based on the context. So just always make sure you understand the conventions of your discipline and your audience and uh, the relevant situation. So I won't go through this whole list. I'll just briefly highlight a couple things on it. So, for example, when it talks about creating a scheduling strategy, uh, just remember how that can be very heavily integrated with where you fall on that spectrum that we just talked about on the previous slide. So, if you all want to be together a lot, that's going to definitely affect how much work it's going to take to make sure that you schedule accordingly. Also, on the file sharing methodology, um, if it's a relatively short document and or a relatively small team, you might just be able to get by with emailing attachments back and forth, particularly if you don't expect it to be a very extensive endeavor. However, I recommend you consider some sort of cloud-based service such as Google Docs, at least for the bulk of the work. And then when you get near the end, if you want to transfer it to MS Word or something to take advantage of certain other features and capabilities, then that can make sense. But I think for when there's a lot of back and forth and a lot of contribution, the cloud-based approach really makes a lot of sense. There's still different approaches to how you handle that. You want to make sure you're all familiar with what approach you're using, that you're all on the same page for how you're going to use it. So, for example, are people just going to edit at will and rely on everybody kind of looking through the thread of who changed what, or are you going to have a convention where everybody just uses a comment to suggest a change, or you have multiple documents where you have different parallel versions for talking about possibilities? So just make sure that you've thought through all this, and that it's all intentional, and you're not leaving things to chance or potential misunderstandings. All right, so this was just a general overview of some points about to keep in mind about collaborative writing that could be useful for a wide range of potential works that may need to be offered jointly. So thanks for watching. Bye.